Why is it showing offline again? It should be streaming again. Okay, yeah, let me see. Yeah, see, I'm live now. Oh, here we go. Yeah. Yeah, this is basically. Yeah, sorry, there's some mistakes with the way the encoder's working at first, but yeah, I was putting up my my information with it. If you're interested, donate to the my Patreon with it. But all the information's there. It's also on the bottom of the chat. Sorry, there's just been some issues with it so far. I don't know why. With getting this stuff up and running, it's been almost like 20 minutes trying to get this up and running. But okay, we'll get down to it first. So on the idea of the news on our ban. Now, basically with it is we need to first look actually at, if you look at a map of the U.S. bases in the Middle East, you'll see that number one is that they're surrounded. You can actually see it within. If you start to what you call not only do that, you'll actually see when you start to add up other countries, you'll actually see that that they are that even beyond that that you will see that they're not only that from the U.S. But you will see that because you'll see like from UAE and bases in Oman, you'll see from there, you'll see bases in Kuwait, Bahrain, Qatar, Iraq. You'll see bases over in Turkey, bases as far south as Jordan, bases in Israel, bases in Egypt, bases in Saudi Arabia, and these are basically all surrounding Iran. Now, and then obviously we have people established in Afghanistan. Mind you, Afghanistan is actually right next door. And if most people do not realize that. Now, if we start to look at this, you will see that this is very, very troubling for those in that country. Now, and now a lot of people have actually suggested that in most of the cases of intervention, that nuclear weapons have actually been a source of an actual bargaining chip. But in this case with it, when we've seen with them, we've seen that there's actually been, from their Ayatollah, there's been a fatwa on anybody who actually develops nuclear weapons, which is actually kind of a little bit interesting, because when we talk about that, we should understand that that means it is a religious crime to develop nuclear weapons. So the fear of nuclear weapons from them, from any other country, should actually be diminished. This means, and actually the what they've actually been developing is actually not meant for nuclear weapons to begin with. Is actually the actual nuclear material they're developing makes a very, very ineffective nuclear weapon. It actually makes they've been using what is uranium, not plutonium. Plutonium's what you want for nuclear weapons. Uranium's what you want for actual energy. And what they've been developing is uranium. Now, uranium is essentially just its main purpose is to be used with nuclear energy. Now, if it can be used in like dirty bombs and stuff like that, but that's really minimal at best, and because of how it works. But for the actual putting on a ballistic missile, it is very, very ineffective, and that's why they use plutonium for that fact. And this is why when it comes to Iran with it, there's really no legitimate fear. Now, we should have fear of other countries that already have them and have them actually in great stock. And countries that have especially have any country that is either directly linked or linked up with any Wahhabist ideology. This means any country within that region that is linked up with Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia is Wahhabist. This is essentially an ideology that believes in basically in a supremacy that believes in taking over other lands, and this is basically what spreads ISIS. That comes out of Saudi Arabia. There's no other land than that spreads that. And they're the ones that actually spread it globally. From Southeast Asia to even in Europe now and the Americas. And this is directly where it comes from, Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia offers nothing other than their main export is terrorism. It is not oil, because they're actually well surpassed in oil exports by Russia and the United States, who've actually surpassed them in oil exports. Their main export is terrorism. And when we look at that, we should realize that Iran doesn't Iran is basically a local player at best, and they really don't believe in terrorism, because essentially, if you look at what they believe in, is they're against imperialism. Well, that would be essentially they're against a couple local players. Number one, they do not take lightly to intervention. This means basically it's not necessarily they're anti-West, that they're essentially they don't like it when the West intervenes. So if the West essentially took a constitutional point of view, they would actually have a positive relationship with them. And this would be in the likes of Ron Paul, Rand Paul, people like that. They would actually have a very, very positive view. Because mind you, that they didn't even have a positive view when dealing with Obama, because Obama was just as interventionist. And the fact is you need for them to actually fully develop an actual good relationship with you, you need to show that you're not going to intervene. And the other factor is that you need to show that you're not going to be linked in with other interventionist regimes. Right now, Israel is and has been run by a neoconservative in Benjamin Netanyahu for quite some time. And that's going to be interventionist policy, and that's not going to be positive. Now, you can't just basically say we're linked with a country just because we think we should be linked with a country. You need to actually make the decision of being linked with a country based on their actual policy. If their policy does not fit what's the best interest of your country, you have to say, we cannot work with you right now until you actually fit to being in the best interest of our country. This is why the idea of being entangled alliances was actually thought of as a bad thing with our founders. And this was reiterated by several different founders, including both Washington and Jefferson. And this should be noted. And when we're talking about this now, when we go on to the point of the next thing that this is going to show why this is why some of the relations has been problematic. We're going to first start with the ideas on the Trump cabinet. Now, with the Trump cabinet is he's had problems with two people specifically, is Pompeo and Bolton, and he's voiced his opinions on them being considered troublesome. But the problem that I have with it is this, which is very, very concerning, is if he's about draining the swamp, which is essentially your the basically the Beltway controlling all of the policies of it, no matter who is elected, and these Beltway think tanks, basically the establishment ones, the neoconservatives or these neoliberals, basically think tanks controlling all policy, no matter who gets elected. And it doesn't matter who it is with it, and then and then these foreign lobbyists basically taking control of the decision making of the of both houses of Congress as well as the executive, and that taking place as well. How are you actually draining the actual swamp when the swamp is just as much in power? Well, the fact is he needs to actually make the decisions on these people. If you're not actually willing to make the decisions, well, who is? And this is the thing where you have such a thing as the National Security Advisor. The National Security Advisor does not have to go through the appointment process. There is no worry of they're not going to allow me to have the person I want. So that is not a case. And if he's upset with Bolton, why even keep him there? Bolton is essentially is a hardcore neoconservative that believes there is no war he does not like. He tried to start a war. He's been trying to start a war in Venezuela, trying to basically oust one socialist for another socialist there, just because of the socialist that he feels he can work with. Because the socialist is basically, they have him wrapped around their finger because they're funneling him money, and they've been having the CIA work with him for the last few years. And then you have out in Iran, he's been wanting war with them for the last 20 or so years. And when it comes down to it, John Bolton does not have any foreign policy experience. This man is a lawyer. He does not have any foreign policy experience. He's never done it. That's why he can't be confirmed. He's never been in a position where he can go through the confirmation process. They've always gone around it, and this is the whole thing with it, is he's gotten himself on these boards, but it's because he's a lawyer, nothing more. He doesn't know anything about foreign policy. He basically all he does is reiterate all of these neoconservative lines, and he does not know a damn thing about foreign policy. He doesn't know anything else. He just knows, let's start a war. This is a person who I don't want in power. Let's oust him. Let's kill this person. That's basically his thing. He never wants to give diplomacy a chance. That's not how you run foreign policy. And he does not have any backing in foreign policy. And that this is where we need to basically have start looking at some of the legitimate decisions on what's going on, and he needs to actually he needs to start actually looking at what's really going on. If he's actually the president, he needs to make his own decisions. And the other one is on and he could put in somebody like Tulsi Gabbard, who's actually going to be a lot more legitimate when it comes down to how to actually run foreign policy. She's going to be a lot more attuned to not intervening into wars and be a lot more attuned to what he actually ran on. And then when it comes down to, and even though that, and I think she can get approved through Congress, because I think they would approve her on the Democratic side, because they're not going to go against their own kind. They're going to have enough Republican votes to approve of her. Even though the neoconservatives aren't going to like it, it's still going to be enough votes, because you're going to have the Democrats are going to vote hands down to if they were to have a vote on this thing with it, but they wouldn't have to, because so she could just go right in. Now, when it comes down to the actual position of the Secretary of State with Pompeo, he's had problems with Pompeo. And I think we can go. We can easily start look to replace Pompeo, and I think Jim Jatras would be actually an excellent option. Now, Jim Jatras is actually someone who actually supported him from the start, and he's actually someone who does not back wars either, and. This is someone who I think could get support from both sides. He is actually a person who has foreign policy experience. He's worked within the UN. He's actually been a diplomat before, and he's worked and he's been able to push the idea of peace. He's worked within the Ron Paul Institute for Peace and Prosperity. He's not going to be pushing for war, and I think this is going to be something that Pompeo could be bumped, and that's something that's going to be that I think they can get enough votes, and being it's a little bit off of the norm, I think that we can actually that it could actually happen, and. If we actually look to some of the things, we could actually see that if that were to happen, if you were to get rid of Pompeo, that would not be a bad option. If you get someone like him, now you're going to have some people say, oh, he's a Russian agent because he speaks on RT. No, he speaks on RT because all the other stations tend to push war. That's why he speaks as a foreign policy advisor for the station RT, because the other stations tend to actually want to push for war. It doesn't matter if they're left leaning or right leaning. All of them want war. And when we start to look at that, now when we start to look at the so he can actually do that, and I think he could actually be nominated and put right through, and we're going to have a lot more sensible situations when it comes down to both immigration and actual foreign policy when it comes down to that position. Now, it might be a little bit of a fight with the military, but the fact is if you give the State Department carte blanche on how you're supposed to deal with things, I think that you can actually have and tell the military to back the hell off. I think that it would change some things around. And the last thing I want to talk on Trump about is on that Huawei executive order. Now, it doesn't directly state Huawei on it, but it's basically directly implicating Huawei. Now, the basic idea with it is it's claiming that Huawei would be a threat to national security by basically it could steal personal information of individuals in the country. Now, we know that this does not hold actual water on that argument. The reason why is we know that the National Security Administration, the NSA, actually does this to American people every day. And if they're going to make this argument against Huawei, that means that they can't do this without basically looking in the mirror. That means that it's not a valid argument. That means it can't be a national security argument, because if they're doing it themselves, how can that? That means they would have to be viewed. Every action that they're doing would have to be viewed as a national security risk, and that would mean that the National Security Administration themselves would have to be shut down, because they themselves would be a national security risk for what they're doing themselves. And then when we go from the opposite end with it, is they've even tried to even state that anybody who purchases or from an individual or corporate level these phones could face jail time and or fines. Now, this is not exactly what we would view as being a fair option. And what it looks like is either A, Huawei refuses to cooperate on these along back doors, which I think is a likely option, or B, it's to support the protectionism on American companies, because Huawei does make their own chips. This does not support U.S.-made chips that a lot of other manufacturers, even foreign manufacturers, support. And this would mean that when we go down to it, that it would essentially not support this protectionist type of plan for American-only companies doing business, or some type of American company being such as like Qualcomm or Motorola, basically getting some type of business from any phone sold. And that's what others have suggested on this thing. Now we're going to end this with this is going to be a little bit more of a brief one with it, so we're going to end it with going over this basically bad decision on Representative Dan Crenshaw basically backing Ed Gallagher. Now, for those who don't know, Ed Gallagher is essentially a leader of a Navy SEALs team who essentially, the SEALs themselves have essentially deserted him because of essentially the horrible things he has done. He has gone off on different things, such as essentially shooting innocent victims in the face while being out there, even different things such as older women and even children, and even forcing his team to watch as he shot them in the face. And this has basically been, they know that it is basically an open and shut case to prosecute him and throw him in jail through a military process. Obviously, it's not going to be a civilian. It's not going to be a civilian trial. Civilian trial is going to be a military tribunal. But Dan Crenshaw, along with some other Republicans, have tried to get Trump to give him a pardon. Now, this is essentially, if you're looking for a career-ending move in politics, there's no other way that you can. There's no other faster way that you can do this, because this man is essentially a copy of like Maurice Solomon Jr. Basically. Pretty much a copy of he's a copy of who essentially was in Vietnam during the Vietnam War, raped a bunch of women, was never prosecuted, and became the Sacramento Slayer and in the U.S. when he returned. And eventually, and basically any type of pardon is going to copy this. And this is something that's very, very troubling. And if you want to basically do that, you're going to essentially create just a massive problem. And we know where this guy's history is going to repeat, and he's only going to get worse, because a pardon is only going to embolden his actions. And this is not exactly like the case of Arpaio, who was doing nothing more than following the law of the land, and that the executive refused to uphold, and was being prosecuted for it. This is a case where this man was not upholding the standard of the military, and they're essentially saying because he served so long and he was leadership in military, that he should get a pass. And if we have any type of standard for the military, for justice being equal, it should basically prosecute everyone equal. It should not say, "Hey, you served in the military. You should be thought of as a higher level person." We have basically Chelsea Manning being harassed for actually disclosing information that is necessary to the public for essentially the U.S. government lying about data on the Iraq War, and that would be Bradley Manning at the time with it, and then going to jail at the time with it, but becoming Chelsea Manning with the sex change. Or I don't know if there was an operation yet with it, but there was but through the transgender stuff with it, but through that, and but through all that stuff with it, but we have that case, and yes, nobody died from that. Nobody was injured from any of those releases, except some egos got hurt from the release of truthful information. And when we look at it, we see that there's someone that's willing to essentially throw their career down a drain for someone who's essentially a murderer. Not just someone who is doing their job out there and who is essentially trying to basically accomplish an objective. No, he wasn't accomplishing objective. He was just committing a homicide. That's why his people and his team have deserted him already. And if your team does not stand by you, I'm sorry, with it, nobody else should. Because in a military with it, your team's going to be standing by you the longest. They're going to be giving you the benefit of the doubt for the longest period. And if your team doesn't stand by you, it means you're not going to get anybody else to stand by you. And that's about it. We're going to cut it right here. Make sure when this goes up to share it all the way around on social media, on Twitter, on Facebook, and everywhere else, to your friends and everywhere publicly. Make sure that you like it here on YouTube, and when it goes up on those other ones, make sure that you like it and then reshare it all the way around on the social media sites elsewhere. I'm probably going to I'll put this up on my Twitter page, that's Big Joe 1221, and on my Facebook, I'll put it up publicly, and then on my podcast thing, that's Joe Singer's podcast, and that'll be on there. you can look on there with their, and then if you wouldn't mind, subscribe to the podcast here, because every subscriber helps, and that's about it. And I will see you guys whenever I have time to do my next podcast or live stream. That's about it. Bye, everyone.